ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the 2016 presidential debate. Thank you. I'll be playing either Gary Johnson or Jill Stein, and Stacy Schiff will be playing whoever she wants to play. No, thank you all for coming out when you should be at home watching Monday Night Football. I do want to mention a couple of upcoming programs, but before I do that, I want to say a special thank you to Rainy Day Books, greatest bookstore in America, small but mighty. To Vivian and Roger for all they do for literature. They have a great author series in which we are honored occasionally to be able to partner with, and tonight is a part of that with Stacy Schiff. So we're very grateful to Rainy Day and all they do for all of us. And I do want to mention a couple of upcoming programs, and we're starting a series, and it's the cover of our October program in honor of my late wife, Maria Rosa Menachal, who was the Sterling Professor of the Humanities at Yale and the Director of the Whitney Humanities Center, a great scholar, a great writer, and my father very generously, late in his life, not long before he died, gave us some money to bring some of the people who were important in her life and important in the life of literature and scholarship in America, and in some of the other things she was interested in, like cooking and music, and there'll be a whole series of these lectures going on over about 18 months, or even a little bit longer. But our very first will be a friend and a colleague of hers at Yale, Carlos Eyre. Carlos, this will be on next Monday, October 3rd. Carlos wrote a National Book Award-winning a memoir of growing up in Cuba before his exile, much like Maria's, and it's called Waiting for Snow in Havana. And his lecture will be called Waiting for Snow in Havana with Maria Rosa. It's a great book. And he's just published, literally this past week, he has published what's probably going to be his masterwork, a 920-page book on the Reformation, a fabulous piece of scholarship. And so we're lucky to have him next Monday. And then next Tuesday, since you will, of course, want more and more about the election, next Tuesday, we're doing the third in our series with Eleanor Clift. We did this in 2008, we did this in 2012, here it is 2016. It's time to do it again. I'm having a conversation with her in which she will play Eleanor Clift and I'll play John McLaughlin, and she'll beat me up. And that should be fun. And so I do want to mention those two upcoming events. And now it's a pleasure for me to introduce, and we'll come out and sit down and have a conversation, to introduce Stacy Schiff, who has become one of the great biographers of our time with her Pulitzer Prize for Véra, The Life of Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, her great book on Ben Franklin, her book on Antoine Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince, author of The Little Prince, which was nominated for, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, her best-selling, stunning biography of Cleopatra, and now her book on the Salem Witch Trials, The Witches. So would you please welcome Stacy Schiff. Schiff, these books, these great books, your Pulitzer Prizes and nominations, many other New York Times top 10 listed books, praises from people like David McCullough, Ron Chernow, Joseph Ellis, Amanda Foreman, Walter Isaacson. Is this the golden age of biography? And do you feel that biography has finally reached its place in the literature of our time?
I do think there are some exceptional biographies being written, and I don't know if we can attribute that, we can thank celebrity culture for that development. I think to some extent we have an interest, healthy or prurient, in people's inner lives, and that those of us who are in and out of the academy writing history have taken that very seriously and thought, wouldn't it be interesting to read about a major world event through the optic of one particular life or one particular sensibility. And I think as readers we appreciate that. I think it makes the history more intimate. So yes, I think there are some stellar biographies being written. There were also stellar biographies being written 100 years ago, but most of them were being written in England. So I think that, yes, this is a golden age of American biography.
Those were those 5-volume biographies with letters attached and whatnot.
The kind of biography that if you said you wanted to write today, your publisher would have to kill you.
Kill you, yeah,
Right,
exactly. At one point, I think, probably obviously in Véra, your biography of Véra Nabokov, you quote Vladimir Nabokov as saying, it's the obligation of the biographer to describe the gluttony for books of the subject when the subject was young. Did you have a gluttony for books when you were growing up, and did you read biographies when you were growing up?
I had a gluttony for books when I was a small child, and then, and I don't know if any of the rest of you had this, I had an academic parent, and so I went off books as my form of not so silent protest for maybe 5 or 10 years. And then I secretly, when she wasn't looking, rediscovered books. But I did that furtively, so she couldn't have the satisfaction of knowing I was back to being a reader, of course. Nothing perverse in that whatsoever. But what I do have is an aversion to writing about people's childhoods in precisely that way that Nabokov describes, where you have to somehow prove that the child was the sort of kernel of the man.
Right,
and
yeah.
that, Saint-Exupéry flew paper airplanes when he was a kid to somehow predict what he's going to become when he grows up. I hate that kind of
Right.
trick the biographer has to pull.
So you didn't, as a child, read the landmark book about the Salem Witch Trials?
I didn't read the landmark books because I grew up in an uncultured household, but I got them for my kids, so I have recently read that book, in fact.
Which, in fact, is by Shirley Jackson.
By Shirley
which is
Jackson.
When I was doing the research for this conversation, I was bowled over. I thought I had a memory of maybe reading the landmark book about, and I'm not sure it was a landmark book when she published it, but that it was by Shirley Jackson, who's the author of The Lottery and what is that? Haunted Hill, House on Haunted Hill. Anyway.
One of the things about the landmark series is they were brilliant at matching author and subject, and that's one of the more brilliant matches.
So it's also, you quote in the Ben Franklin biography, you quote Benjamin Franklin saying a biography should be admirable or exemplary, about an admirable or exemplary person. Now that's obviously in Witches, there are a lot of not so admirable or exemplary people, and it's arguable, I guess, about Ben Franklin, though you certainly make him admirable. What is your view of the responsibility of the biographer? Is it to present someone who's admirable and exemplary, or?
Well, I think it would be hard to write the life of someone whom you didn't in some way admire, even if you don't have to admire them entirely, and you don't really want to fall in love with them, because that too makes for lousy biography, I think. But there has to be something that attracts you, and there has to be something that keeps you going through the project. So either the work has to be of some interest, or some aspect of the life has to be exemplary in some way. I think a biography in which you are simply in awe of your subject and in love with your subject throughout is a pretty dull book, and also probably a fairly misleading book.
Right.
As to what draws a biographer to a particular subject, I'm sometimes myself mystified, but I do think there has to be a resonance of some kind and some sort of awe. I think there's an elegiac quality to some extent to biography.
And so you write 4 biographies of certainly people who had many admirable traits in Saint-Exupéry and Franklin, Véra Nabokov, who's the most subtle of these characters, and Cleopatra, who is perhaps the most controversial for a variety of reasons, but certainly interesting and certainly admirable in your hands in a lot of different ways, which we could go into. But Witches is very different. Number one, it's not really a biography, though in some ways it's a series of biographies. There are many people, many characters in the book in whom you give a pretty full accounting of what's known about their lives, but it's certainly not, number one, about admirable people largely, and it's a very different book than your previous 4 books. So is there anything exemplary about it?
I think one of the things that surprised me most with this material was discovering who the heroes were going to be. And because they're not who you think, the sane voices that finally emerged toward the end of the witchcraft epidemic, it's really 10 months from beginning to end, are not the same voices you expected them to be. The governor, for example, who's something of a Philistine, comes off as one of the great heroes of the tale. And I think watching carefully to see when you're going to be able to hear these voices of dissent, and when people finally begin to speak up against the trials and realize that justice has miscarried, they do so very carefully and anonymously and very quietly. And it's not clear when those voices are ever going to be heard, and who finally speaks up is rather surprising. And one of them is a very eminent Boston minister, for example. So that part of it is I think is very affirming with the story. But most people do not act admirably. You're absolutely right. And that was part of what interested me.
Right, and so it begs the question, it seems to me, is who the main character is, too, in the book. Salem, in a way, is a character in the book. The Puritans, or the Puritan, much like the statue in Boston of the Puritan, is a character. The accused and the accusers are characters, obviously lots of characters, and the judges are very much a character as a group, it seems to me. You group them together and you draw the distinctions, but they seem for a while, at least, to be the one and the same person. They all are marching in the same direction until they stop marching, which happens very quickly. And then the other character is the Mather family, who are very, very important. Cotton Mather and Increase Mather, who in some ways represent the Puritans. Did you see it that way? Did you see this as a series of characters that represented by individuals, or?
One of the things that drew me to the subject, and I think many writers have had this experience, is that you go to the shelf to look for a book, you're curious about something, or you become obsessed with something, as I did in this case, and you go to the shelf to look for a book, and the book you really want to read isn't there. And in this case, I wanted to really know more about how this felt on an individual basis. What drove someone to make a witchcraft accusation? What did an adolescent girl who might have thought she was bewitched really think and feel? What did she long for? What made her anxious? What did she dream about? What did it feel like to live in 17th century New England? What was early modern America like? And that book didn't, as far as I could tell, exist. And so in that sense, I felt I was very much getting from the court testimony, from the depositions, a sense of what these people were conjuring with, what the strains on their society was. You hear a lot of the individual voices in the confessions when people tell the witchcraft court what they said to the devil and the compacts they make with the devil. And many people, because the devil always offers you something in exchange for your soul. So what people ask for is always, or what people are receiving is very indicative. So someone might get relief from her chores. Someone else might get a new wardrobe. One woman is promised revenge on her enemies. You begin to get a sense of the inner lives of these people. And that was something that I felt a biographer could do and maybe wasn't already on the page.
So the extraordinary thing, though, is that so many people did confess. I mean, it led to 19 or 20 people being killed, being executed. What would lead someone to confess?
There are a number of reasons to confess.
Assuming that the accusations weren't true, which I think we have to assume.
As my husband said to me soon after I started, how are you sure they weren't witches? Thanks, honey. It turns out, as we all know from any number of accounts recently, it turns out to be not so difficult for a figure of authority to extract a false confession, first of all. Second of all, for the most part, the people confessing are vulnerable members of society who have rarely been interrogated so intently by authorities, by men who have great fortunes, live in great homes, are beautifully dressed and speak beautifully, and moreover are master logicians. So that, for example, one woman early on, this is Bridget Bishop, who comes into court, essentially says, I'm not a witch, I don't even know what a witch is, to which the justice replies, how can you say you're not a witch if you don't even know what a witch is? So, she's caught up by that remark. As the summer wears on, first of all, it's also not difficult for someone who is a practicing or a devout Puritan to believe that he or she might actually be in compact with the devil. And you hear that in the testimony too. You hear people hesitating, thinking to themselves and saying aloud, Is it that I'm having trouble confessing to witchcraft because I'm innocent, or is it because the devil is stopping my voice? Because that idea that you were a sinner and inadequate and already a reprobate at the age of 22 was very much a part and parcel of the religion. And these are very pious people, to which confession comes naturally because it's part of the practice. By the middle of the summer, confession is also a means of rescuing yourself. It is very quickly understood that the people who confess to witchcraft are not the ones who are going to hang. They'll be sent back to prison, but they will not hang. And there, at that point, there's this torrent of confessions, and inside each of those confessions is often a gleaming shrapnel of accusation against someone else. And that's how the fire begins to really exceed the boundaries of Salem. It ultimately will affect 24 communities.
And the 24 communities, Salem, and you draw some interesting distinctions between Salem the town and Salem the village. There's a distinction between Salem and Boston that you draw. But there's also, one most interesting to me, and I have two questions about this. One is why so much? In Andover, the highest percentage, which is not that close to Salem, it's fairly far away, and there's something like 50 of 600
It's basically 1 in 12 people is accused of witchcraft.
Of witchcraft. It's the highest percentage. And why Andover as opposed to anywhere else? And why isn't Andover a little better known than it is, given that Salem's gotten all the glory for this? And then the second question is, and this is because we're both alumni of Andover. Did going to Andover, the boarding school, did that have anything to do with this? Did you know when you were at Andover, when you were boarding at Andover, about the witch trials and Andover's place in it?
Let me take the first part first. I think Andover is as devastated as it is by the witchcraft. And by the time the witchcraft reaches Andover, it's really a free-for-all. Mothers are accusing daughters, daughters are accusing their mothers and their grandmothers, ministers are accusing parishioners, parishioners are accusing ministers. The older Andover minister finds out that he's related to something like 22 witches in all. I mean, it's just out of control at this point. Partly that happens because of what I just said about confession. It is now understood that confession was the way to go. It was a safer place to go. And people have begun to just roll over in front of the justices. Partly people are really terrified at this point. It's hard for us to understand, but most people believe, the majority of the population does believe that witchcraft is at work. They see these seemingly bewitched girls. The girls are in the courtroom every day. They're sort of exhibit A for the prosecution. They're screaming, they're writhing, they're falling into trances, they seem to be flying across the room. Everyone's in very close quarters. There is a sense that there is a bewitchment at work. And once you begin to believe that witchcraft is among you and is at work, all kinds of oddities can be explained. So it really kind of cleans up the neighborhood in a way. And all kinds of ancient grievances can be reactivated. And pretty much as is often the case with small communities, pretty much everyone had something against his or her neighbor. So this was a very convenient way to trot out those grudges and those antipathies, in fact. So Andover really is this sort of feverish moment. Andover comes up with a different story of witchcraft than had the earlier communities. And that's partly because there's this sort of demented game of telephone going on. And by the time the story travels to Andover, it has taken on the proportion of a diabolical plot against the state. And the Andover confessors all tell this story. There are more than 50 people who tell this story of flying to a diabolical Sabbath, and which is orchestrated by a minister who's been accused and who in fact will hang. And that is really an Andover, and having a satanic baptism, that's really an Andover quality, not a Salem quality. So it's a different kind of witchcraft, in fact. I knew nothing of this when I lived in Andover. Did you?
No, I didn't.
Nothing.
Actually.
Salem today, what happens after the story is really interesting in that for generations, Salem will not address its history and really does its best to bury it. And then in the 1970s, finally, Bewitched, the TV series, filmed 7 episodes in Salem. And suddenly Salem, which had fallen on very hard economic times, realized it could exploit this history. And it termed itself Witch City, and it erected a monument to Elizabeth Montgomery, the star of Bewitched, in downtown Salem. And it now, I mean, as many of you may know, it is now the place to go for Halloween, which is a month-long celebration in Salem. And actually, the first time I worked in the archives there, the archivist said to me, whatever you do, don't come back in October. So.
But you were able to buy a broomstick and...
You can buy a broomstick there, and you can buy crystals there, and a magic wand, and yeah.
So, but I am interested in the fact that it skipped Boston, more or less. And the small community obviously is part of it, and you've said that. Is there something about being on the edge? Particularly, I'm thinking of Andover. Salem was a little closer to the rest of civilization, but most of the communities in the 1690s, except for Boston, perhaps, were not only small, but they're on the edge of the frontier. They're wilderness communities. They see themselves as being on an errand in the wilderness, and you talk about Indian attacks that happen almost simultaneously. They're worried about the French who are wandering down from Canada, or they're wandering up to Canada to attack the French. They're worried about popish ceremonies of the Anglicans and others. Is there an atmosphere that happens to be created at that moment, of fear on the frontier, fear in the wilderness, that's part of this, and that Boston may have been less subject to because it's a larger city?
This by no means happens in a vacuum, and I should have said that the first afflictions, the first seemingly bewitched girls, begin to exhibit signs of witchcraft at the end of a very harsh winter, which also happens to be a harsh winter which they have spent indoors, I should add, at a time when the village minister, in whose house they both live, one is the daughter and one is the niece of the minister, is under fire from his congregants. He's at odds with his congregants who will not deliver his firewood because they're essentially boycotting paying his salary. So his house is cold. These girls are basically confined to this home on the frontier. Indian attacks have been constant. A very devastating war, King Philip's War, had ended 14 years earlier. There is news that a new war is afoot. There is, at this moment, no settled government in Massachusetts. So not only is there this sense of vulnerability, but there is a political and economic dislocation. And everyone is waiting rather impatiently and in the dark for a new charter to arrive. And no one really knows what form that new charter will take and who the new governor will be, but rumors are rampant. So there's a huge degree here of anxiety and of uncertainty and of suspicion, to which these girls certainly would have felt some pangs, even if they themselves didn't really understand what that news was.
And you said these girls, and one of the remarkable things, and you in the book you seem to start to make an argument. They're very young girls, some of these girls who are making accusations, and some of the accused are also very young. I mean, very, very young. The accusers are 9 and 11 years old, and some of the accused are 4 and 5 years old or 8 years old. And that this is an adolescent phenomenon. Is there some part of this that is hormonal, or is something that we, from our experience with teenagers, might recognize? Is that an argument that you would make?
Well, I think that any of us who has either lived with or ever been a teenager would recognize some of this behavior, certainly.
I mean, it's a severe form of acting out, one has to say, to accuse people of
I think
witchcraft.
that it's very hard to diagnose these girls. It's very hard to know what could have ailed them. Hysteria or conversion disorder apparently tends to happen very often to women and very often to young women. If that is indeed what these girls were suffering from, it makes sense given the strains on them and the strains on their communities at this point. They are clearly trying to say something that they can't say, whether that was because they had been the victims of sexual abuse, whether that was because they were afraid of being kidnapped by Indians, as had happened, whether that was because they had read too much about the forthcoming apocalypse or about hell and brimstone, is unclear to us. That ability to merge or confuse the natural world and the supernatural world is something that I think is a part of teenagerdom, at least if my experience with teenagers is any good. I don't really know why I wrote this book, but only after I finished did a friend point out to me that I had been living with an adolescent girl the entire time I was working on it. So.
And It's also interesting to me. You talk at various times in the book. They're constantly with us in the book. The Mather family, Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather, the great Puritan preachers. And all the while this is going on, I think if I'm correct, that he started his book before the outbreak of the accusations. Cotton Mather's writing a book called Wonders of the Invisible World. And it's almost like he's creating the witchcraft episode as an experiment for his book, as a controlled experiment for his book about what's going on in the invisible world. And you have an interesting time with him as a character. He's a really fascinating character in the book. Can you say more about him?
Oh, I could speak about him for hours. I have this weird, perverse intellectual crush on Cotton Mather, which is really not a sign of sanity. There's a brilliant biography of Cotton Mather, actually, by Ken Silverman, and it's probably one of the best books on the Puritan world. Let me just back up for a second and say that one of the stunning things about the trials is that it's the most erudite, most enlightened men in Massachusetts, which is to say the Mathers, who are really most intimately associated with them and who are themselves, they have read everything there is to be read about witchcraft at this point. They know the justice system backwards and forwards. They are the ones advising the court. And they are the ones who are really perpetrating the crisis in many ways. From Cotton Mather's point of view, the descent of witchcraft, in which he is scientifically and theologically interested, is not really a bad thing, because it is proof that the colony of Massachusetts is chosen and is exceptional in some way. And he sees this epidemic as a sort of badge of honor. It's proof that the New Englanders are the chosen people, and moreover, it's proof that the second coming is near. So he embraces this particular delusion for many reasons, and even afterwards, even in several years afterwards, he will write that really there was nothing wrong with what happened because the devil got nothing out of the deal, and the church just filled the pews, and the young people of Massachusetts learned a great deal. So really, what was the problem? Forgetting that 20 people died in the process. But he sees it through a very scientific context, and he's always trying to apply what he knows about witchcraft and what he has read of the great witchcraft experts to what is happening in Massachusetts. And in doing so, he will in part infect what people begin to see, because you can see that much of this is what I said, the demented game of telephone, much of what is described in the witchcraft practice in Andover comes directly from the writings of Cotton Mather.
Right, and the word epidemic is an important word, it seems to me, because there's another epidemic that happens later after this is all over, which is the cholera. Smallpox epidemic, in which he becomes a hero. I think you even used that word about him because he believes in inoculation. He's in many ways, he's a figure of the Enlightenment, and you make the case that Enlightenment figures like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton and John Locke, who are seen by us today as the great rationalists who created the age of rationalism, they all believed in magic in one form or another.
Although there's an irony there, which is that Cotton Mather essentially gets off scot-free for all of his advice during the witchcraft crisis, but when he advocates for inoculation 20 years later, he will be vilified for this idea. And in fact, a bomb is thrown through his window in an attempt to kill him, because people think it's such a dangerous idea that he should be suggesting anyone be inoculated against smallpox.
And so the notion, another notion that you talk about in the book that I find fascinating, which is about the concept, the Puritan concept, in essence, the city on the hill as a stage, and that the Puritans saw themselves, and many of the people you write about see themselves as on a stage in which there is a design, a play, in essence, being written by God, and to prove. They are there to prove that they are one of the characters dressed in white, if you will, on this stage, on the city on the hill, and that the world is divided up into the good guys and the bad guys, the devil's disciples and the disciples of God, and there's the need for proof that you are one of the elect, one of the chosen, a basic Puritan concept. Is that part of the story here?
It certainly is. It plays a huge role in the sense of the stress and the strain on you if you you have this pious disposition if you are a practicing Puritan, because you have the sense of preordination. You don't know if you're preordained, however, to be the saved or the damned, and you walk around not knowing whether those blots on your conscience are going to be the end of you. And there are any number of young people, in fact, on the record, not involved with the witchcraft, who will at really early ages go to adults in their lives, and I'm thinking here in particular of one of Samuel Sewell's daughters, who will go to their parents when they're 12 or 14 and basically say, I'm a reprobate, there's no hope for my salvation, I would like a new heart. And they have this sense that it's already too late for them. Salvation is not going to be within their purview, within their means. And you can understand how that could be utterly terrifying. There's also a sort of communal take on this, which is that it seemed you were doing your duty if you turned in your neighbor for witchcraft, because communal purity was highly important. An entire church, an entire meeting house had to be pure. And therefore, it was incumbent on you to denounce your neighbor. And that, too, will add to the epidemic proportions here. But that sense of watchfulness, of knowing what your neighbor was doing, of feeling you were being watched, of watching into the darkness, definitely has something to do with this. As we all know, when you're terrified and you're looking for something, the smudge on the wall begins to move. I mean, there's a sense there that there may well be an Indian lurking behind the bush, but if you're terrified, you know you're going to see an Indian lurking behind the bush.
You have a great phrase in the book, and for those of you who haven't read any of Stacy Schiff's books, she writes wonderfully, and these wonderful phrases. One of the great phrases I think is about I quote you, the dread of spiritual numbness, that the Puritans needed to be alive to God being with them on the stage all the time. They needed to know that. And that teenage girl is Samuel Sewell's daughter, who doesn't know whether or not she's doing the right thing, or is sure she's not doing the right things, maybe because she doesn't feel the Spirit moving in her.
When you ask about confession, any number of people will confess to witchcraft because they think they didn't feel sufficiently moved in meeting, and they think that must mean they are in cahoots with the devil because they don't have the religious fervor that they think that they should. So there's this guilt, and by the way, a guilty conscience hadn't yet been invented, so that sense that you were guilty of something was something you very often interpreted as witchcraft. But there's this sense of guilt that they couldn't muster the religious fervor necessary, therefore somehow they must be diabolically implicated.
The guilt and the fear and the willingness to confess to something all seems understandable, but what doesn't seem understandable to us, I think, and I mean, you've talked a little bit about it, but still it's hard to understand how inside a family, fathers and mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters could accuse each other of very, very specific things, such as flying through the night to go to these meetings and appearing. There are all these spectral things where people appear in one place and have these conversations, things that can't happen, that can't physically happen. And there are some challenges to that go on. Is there some quality of mass delusion that's going on here? Because it seems very hard, but from 2 points of view. One, the total family breakdown, the willingness to accuse the people who are closest to you of these things, and then this belief in things that can't physically happen.
Well, let me take a specific example. Very early on in the crisis, among the first people who's brought in, comes a 14-year-old girl from neighboring Topsfield. It's just a community just beyond Salem Village, named Abigail Hobbs. And when Abigail Hobbs is brought into the court, she decides to throw not only her mother, but her father as well under the bus. So she tells the court that it's actually her stepmother, both her stepmother and her father are witches. When you think about it, a lot of 14-year-old kids, I'm sure, would be happy to say this about their parents, right? I mean, it's not all that surprising, and especially when you hear more about Abigail from her stepmother, who then tells the court, tearing her hands, says, I don't know what to do with this girl. She's clearly disrespectful. She was clearly, even among her friends, she was clearly a very obstreperous kid. She tried to run away from home. She screamed at neighbors. She threw water at her stepmother and called her a heathen and pretended to baptize her. I mean, she was a terror. But a great way for that to manifest in 1692 was to tell these authorities in the neighboring town that her parents were witches. And it's Abigail, in fact, who will help move the narrative along, because she will name the person, she will point a finger toward the person who is thought to be the mastermind behind this huge plot. What was the first half of your question? Maybe I've just forgotten it. Seeing things that don't.
Yeah.
The power of suggestion is extraordinary here. And very often, there's an emperor's new clothes aspect to
Right.
it. Very often, someone in the court will point to someone and they'll say, she's not really in her seat, she's sitting there on the beam, and it will be as if everyone can see that person. Or my favorite is probably when the 11-year-old girl, the niece of the minister, is in a local tavern during a day when there are hearings being held, and she will go up to a young man, a farmer in his early 20s, and say, I see a witch over there. And she'll get him to stab at it with first his pitchfork and later with his rapier. So he's stabbing at this object that he can't even see at her direction. I mean, this is how everyone at this point is so terrified. And she's telling him, oh, you got it, I can see blood all over the floor. And he's completely buying into this. And he will later testify that he helped her defeat this spectral presence.
So this all happens over about 7-8 months, something like that, and there are people who challenge it. Certainly, some of the accused challenge it, but there are some people from outside who are challenging this. And why weren't there more, particularly from outside, Boston, and you talk about Thomas Brattle and others? Because it's very localized, it seems to me, and the governor does eventually step in, as you said. Phipps is sort of a hero, but he doesn't initially. And why wasn't there more opposition? And then how did the opposition happen when it finally came? Because it seems to almost drop off the table at some point towards the end of 1692.
Well, the first person who suggests that perhaps the girls are not bewitched very quickly is accused of witchcraft. So that wasn't a good idea. And the next person who will of whom we know, because the record is faulty here, the next person who will suggest that perhaps there is no diabolical mastermind and this is perhaps delusional will be faced with either an incredibly hefty fine or a court sentence. He's actually a Baptist minister in Boston. That wasn't such a good idea either, obviously. So those are both before the summer. What we don't understand, or one of the biggest mysteries, and I can't solve this one, is until this point, Massachusetts these are extremely litigious people. They have been in court constantly for the previous decades, and reading the court record is one of the great joys of working in Puritan America, because you get to read all of the sordid detail of what everyone has against his neighbor. But there are an enormous number of suits for slander and for defamation. In those occur in earlier cases when people are accused of witchcraft. Wives who are accused of witchcraft, their husbands will sue the person who had accused. None of that happens in 1692. There's not a single case of defamation. There's not a single suit for defamation. And the only conclusion one can draw for that is that there is this real fear about opposing the system. This thing has snowballed so quickly out of control. The people who are skeptical about it are so quickly put back in their places or into prison that no one will venture any kind of defamation suit. Only toward the end of the summer, when the accusations begin to reach a very high level, when the number of witches seems to just defy the imagination. At this point, people are saying there are 500 witches in New England. There are hundreds of people in prison. At which point it becomes rather inconvenient to attend a witchcraft trial, because it's really time to go back to harvest your fields and fill your cellar for the winter. Only at that point do people begin to speak up. And as I said, they do so anonymously. Samuel Willard, who's the minister who finally weighs in, he's a somewhat more conservative minister than the Mathers. He's equally illustrious. And he will publish a dialogue about the trials between one man who's skeptical and one man who isn't. But he will publish it anonymously and with a false imprint that seems to indicate that the pages had been published in Philadelphia, not in Boston, which tells you how difficult it was at this point to speak out against the court. And Thomas Brattle, who's the young mathematician who speaks out, will do so anonymously.
Right. And so why did it end then? because some of the people, as you describe in the book, are perfectly willing for it to go on. They don't think they've got all 500 witches.
It seems to be a power struggle by that point between the Chief Justice of the court, William Stoughton, who was clearly, who's a zealot, and who was clearly, and for many, who has his own agenda and his own reasons to be prosecuting, a deep believer in witchcraft, and someone who early on had abetted the crisis by basically saying to the jurors, it's not up to you to prove that the witchcraft was actually inflicted on these girls. You simply need to prove that there was the intention to practice witchcraft, which of course makes it easier to prosecute in the first place. He's very eager for the court to continue. The newly seated governor, for his own reasons, is very eager for the court to be disbanded. This problem is exacerbated by the fact that the Chief Justice, William Stoughton, is also the deputy governor, and brilliant, and the newly installed governor, Phipps, is not so smart, and Stoughton can run circles around him. So there does seem to be this power struggle between the two men, and ultimately Phipps will prevail.
And you talk a lot about the judges, and they all seem well-educated, well-off, people of substance in more than one way. And Samuel Sewall in particular seems to very surprising, and particularly surprising when you know that later on, and not terribly later on, 5 years later, he repents. He famously repents. And what kept him in line?
When you begin to, there's a huge political subtext, I guess I should say here, and that, which goes back to the installation of the new governor and the new charter. And these men who are on the court, many of whom I should add, are in business together, have married into each other's families, have long sat on courts together and have long governed the colony together, need for their own reasons to move in lockstep. They very much need to prove at this point that they can adjudicate witchcraft, that they are in control, that the colony, in the eyes of the English anyway, is not an obstreperous, rebellious place, that they are going to live by their new charter, and that they are going to rule themselves. They don't need any British interference. And because they have previously overthrown a royal governor. So there's a real law and order need here, which Stoughton very much answers, and which keeps that court moving in lockstep. Samuel Sewall, who is the only one of the justices who will in fact ask for forgiveness for his role in the trials, is not the kind of man under any circumstances who's willing to venture outside his peer group, to take a step in the other direction. And always in his diaries, which make for extraordinary reading, he's a very sensitive man. He'll always suffer when he's criticized by his peers, and especially when criticized by the Mathers. And you can see how that sense that his colleagues were in this completely would keep him in check. And these men do move entirely in lockstep.
So you analogize this to other moments of mass hysteria, or at least fear breaking out. We might even have a little bit of it today, such as the McCarthy period, which was Arthur Miller, famously The Crucible, which his play and been made into a movie, did. Is that an accurate description of what you think, that it is analogous to other moments in our history, or would you say it's unique?
Well, the witchcraft piece of it, I would say, is unique. The idea of, I mean, look, the two things these people most feared were immigration and terror. So there is a certain analogy there. I mean, they thought that, nefarious boatloads of Catholics were going to disembark into Boston and subvert the state, but, if they could have built a wall, they would have. So yes, I do see a certain analogy there. It was Arthur Miller who makes the McCarthy analogy. He actually comes to the trials through the analogy of the Holocaust. And then when he starts to work on Salem, I think it's his wife who says to him there's a difference between
Marilyn
hunting.
Monroe?
No, previous wife. Inga, wasn't
right.
that her name? Who says to him there's a difference between hunting for communists and hunting for witches, because there actually were communists and there presumably were no witches. But that sense of having to demonize and having to, and playing with the politics of fear and attributing fictive things to the other, I think is very, we have a very tribal instinct, and I think we do that very naturally. Wasn't it the governor of Maine who recently said, this year, said that the Syrian refugees were bringing Zika with them into America.
Right, Paula Page.
Kind of the same thinking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And on the other hand, one of the things you do in all your books that's wonderful, and you quote Jean Renoir, a famous statement that one of his characters makes in Les Règles du Jeu, the Rules of the Game, his movie, that everyone has their reasons. And so you seem to me the power of this book, which is also the power of your other books, is that all the characters in the drama have their reasons and are understandable at some level. And is that a character trait of yours, or is that some conscious thing that you're doing as you write?
It was what fascinated me most, I think, with this story, is that everyone does have his reasons. Everyone has an agenda, including the girls, by the way. The ministers have an agenda, the girls have an agenda, the local authorities have an agenda, the court has an agenda. It just isn't the stated agenda. And it was really important to me as I worked that the reader, for better or worse, not know the answers to the mysteries, that the book read with a certain sense of suspense, and you don't get to what the actual agendas were. You may divine it because there are clues in every chapter, but you don't really get the answers until the end of the book for what might have been driving these people. Why was Cotton Mather moving this forward with such passion? What were these girls really reacting to? What was the real strain on the court, and why this relentless prosecution in 1692? There had been witchcraft in the colony before 1692, and in fact a witch had hanged 3 years earlier on Boston Common, and although she names other names, it goes no further. So why in 1692, under very similar circumstances, does this turn into a hunt?
So some historians criticize biographers for saying precisely that it's the Jean Renoir philosophy that everyone has their reasons, that you become too buried into the psychology of the individual, the subject of the biography, and leads to excuse or ignoring the historical forces that are out there. Do you see that as a danger in biography or a strength of biography?
I think that's always a danger. I think in equal danger, I guess if you're going to go back to the historian side, is pursuing a thesis to the point where you don't see anything else. And that was very important to me here, where you have an event which is really a perfect storm of forces, that if you looked at this story, and I felt as if I were looking at it with the same sense of bewilderment that an early modern American was looking at his world. He's just trying to make sense of things, and witchcraft is his solution. And it's a very effective one. I'm looking back at this crisis and saying, how could this have happened? And to pick only one strand of the story, or to write it down to a fungus in the rye, or a property dispute, or Indian terror, was to be very simplistic, and you needed to really look at the entire tapestry to see what the multiple forces that were at work here were.
And there's a quality, particularly in 3 of your books, in this book, and in Cleopatra, and in Véra, about Vladimir Nabokov, in which you seem to be making the case that women historically, particularly in those 3 cases, don't have a voice among the historians, particularly the all-male historians of earlier days. Is it important to you that you're giving women a voice in these books, giving Cleopatra her own voice as opposed to Cicero's or Plutarch's voice about her, and Vladimir Nabokov, who really has been seen through Vladimir Nabokov's life, and then all these girls and women in Salem and Andover, are you giving them a voice? Is that?
Well, I like to think I might be, yes. When I started the Nabokov book, for example, Véra Nabokov, every one of Nabokov's books except for one is dedicated to Véra. And actually that one exception is dedicated to his mother in one edition, but to Véra in another edition, which is a tricky way to do things. Every book is dedicated to Véra. She went with him to class every day when he taught at Cornell. She types every letter of his. She helps him to research and to write. She saves Lolita from the flames. She helps him with translation. When I started that book, although every document that comes out of the typewriter is written or typed by her, her husband's biographer said to me, good luck with the book, but there's really no documentation. That was despite the fact that she's written all his letters. So yes, I felt that I was restoring a voice that had been somehow lost. She keeps a diary of Lolita's publication. But in that diary, she puts a tremendous amount about herself, about her feelings about fame, about her feelings about her husband, about what it was to be Jewish in America, about McCarthy, whom she fully supported. That diary is extremely revealing. I thought of it as her diary. Her husband's biographer thought of it as the book about Lolita's publication. So yes, I think that coming at this from a different vantage point is.
And of course, one of the things you learn, and I assume it's probably in some of the other biographies too, but of Vladimir, but is that she saved Lolita. He was going to destroy Lolita, and he's actually burning the manuscript, and she has to leap in.
Pulls it out of the flames.
And save it. And
then goes to the Ithaca bookstore when they're at Cornell and moves all the copies of Lolita to in front of other people's books. So you could only buy copies of Lolita, which is the ultimate act of loyalty.
But it's really, I think your book, the Véra book, is an extraordinary book because she doesn't have a voice. She is seen through his eyes and his biography, and there isn't that much documentation about it. So you're taking someone who and she very consciously did that. You make it very clear that she doesn't want her story to be told independently of their marriage. Partly, I would assume, because she struggled pretty hard to make sure he stayed in it and stayed in the marriage, got him committed to that, and then had to keep him committed to his writing and to putting food on the table for the family.
One of the most telling sources I had for that book was a set of page proofs of a previous biography of Nabokov, which the Nabokovs had asked to be shown to them for approval before it was published. And Véra had gone through and she'd crossed out things she didn't want him to say. She basically edited the book, and she'd written things in the margin. But then she erased every one of her changes. So in order to see what she'd written, I was sort of having to hold this thing up to the light. I mean, it was almost, but that was what she'd done with her life. Was she essentially had been there every step of the way, but then did everything she could to efface her presence.
And then the great thing about the Cleopatra biography, it seems to me, is that her story has been told as the story of Antony and Cleopatra, Caesar and Cleopatra. It's the story, and the story of Rome. It's part of the story of Rome. And you make the great case for her as the Empress of Egypt, and Egypt's great wealth. Alexandria is the greatest city. I mean, it is fascinating that, in your view, which I think is obviously correct, that Alexandria was the great city of the first century BCE, not Rome, and that the Romans were jealous of Alexandria. And again, did you give a voice to Cleopatra? Did you feel that she hadn't got her rightful place in the world? She was seen too much as the seductress and the sex pot.
Well, I think since we all think she's Elizabeth Taylor, there was some work to be done here.
Yeah.
Yes. At one point, I had a taxi driver when I was working on that book, and I said I was working on a book about Cleopatra, and he said, "Did you meet her?" And I thought, okay. And only a few years later did I realize, oh my goodness, he meant Elizabeth Taylor. Everything we have about Cleopatra, almost without exception, comes to us from Roman men. And she is a Greek woman. And there is a reason why what we have is sheer propaganda. And she does, in fact, inhabit what is at that time the most sophisticated, most educated, most cosmopolitan, and most opulent city in the Mediterranean. At this point, and this is something we've entirely lost grasp of because of the Roman propagandists, Rome is a backwater. It is a muddy, provincial, dusty, dirty place where the buildings are always collapsing and where you can't buy a decent book unless you send to Alexandria for it. And if you wanted a doctor or you wanted a tutor or you wanted anyone with any education, you went to Alexandria, which had basically inherited Athens's mantle. And that's something which, because history was left to the Romans of the next couple of hundred years, we've lost sight of. So I did feel like there was a restoration of not only Cleopatra, but the world from which she hailed that was important. And it tells us something about how, too, those Romans see her, because she is infinitely wealthier. They have this vague understanding that she descends from Alexander the Great, whom they all revere. She is royal. And these things were, all of them, a little irritating to the Romans, especially to the ever-eloquent Cicero, from whom we have a really hateful portrait of Cleopatra.
You're really tough on Cicero in the book, that's for sure.
Yeah. I know. I prefer Cotton Mather. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So I think we'll take questions in a second, but one thing I'd like to do is a quote from, in Véra, you quote Vladimir Nabokov talking about Lolita, and I think this is apropos of all three books. She's defending Lolita. Lolita, of course, is attacked, incredibly attacked in many ways, becomes, of course, immediately a huge bestseller upon publication, but it's attacked by the critics, including some pretty significant critics who should have known better. So she says, I wish, though, somebody would notice the tender description of the child's helplessness, her pathetic dependence on monstrous Humbert, and her heart-rending courage all along, culminating in that squalid but essentially pure and healthy marriage. The horrid little brat Lolita is essentially very good indeed. And it seems to me that what she's doing for Lolita, you do for her, and do for the voices of the other characters, of so many of the characters in Witches, and for Cleopatra herself. You give voice to these characters who've been maligned in history or have not had a place in history. So I just want to thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
So I think we'll take eight or 10 questions, and if you come up to the microphones, ask your question. And there will be a book signing afterwards here on this stage.
Well, I'm always curious about why authors choose particular subjects. So briefly, why Véra? Why witches? Why Cleopatra?
I always feel that authors, or at least I, am incredibly misleading because I realize the reason, 10 years after the fact. To put it in as neat a form as I can, after my first book, I really wanted to write about a family relationship. I didn't want to write a single biography, and I had always been a Nabokov nut. And I got hung up on this idea that every single book is dedicated to Véra. I think I knew 3 things about her. She was Jewish and he wasn't. She carried a handgun in her purse, and every book was dedicated to her, and that's all I knew. And there was very little written on Nabokov because he had essentially he was so terrifying to biographers and so litigious with biographers that he had kept them away. Every biographer who had written before that time had said, Nabokov could never have been who he was without Véra, but there will always be a hole at the center of the story. And that was like a red flag to me. Like, are we really going to just leave it as a hole? Cleopatra was an idea I'd had before I wrote a book on Ben Franklin, and I couldn't figure out how to do it. I was fascinated with her. I thought she had gotten a bad rap from the Romans. I couldn't see how you could write a traditional biography of her, and even as I worked on it, I would almost forget to tell people what I was working on because I was vaguely embarrassed about what I was doing because there's no archive. After the Ben Franklin book, where there was so much of an archive you wanted to kill yourself, Cleopatra became a really brilliant idea. So after 2 years in the French archives, reading 17th century handwriting on microfilm, 18th century, sorry, I decided that Cleopatra with no archive was an idea of genius. But really that came out of, interestingly, I had been writing a column for the New York Times that was that the first time Hillary runs for office. I had been writing a lot about women in power. And I was fascinated by the idea, and Cleopatra seemed the greatest, most illustrious example. There is no woman in power, with the possible exception of maybe an English queen, who ruled as Cleopatra did, or who was as wealthy as she was. And after Cleopatra, I was still hung up on this idea of women and voices and women not being able to speak and feeling smothered, the damage that a woman can do when she does speak, the inability, what makes it impossible for a woman to speak. And I wanted to do something a little more ambitious about a subject that seemed to me as misunderstood as was Cleopatra. I think we all take our ideas of Salem from the Crucible, and very few of us know what actually happened. We all think the witches burned, they hanged. Every aspect of it we've mutilated. So it seemed to me in that respect like it was a sort of Cleopatra cousin. That's the short version. But I was living with this adolescent girl, so that may have had something to do with it.
In the course of your research on the witches, did you come across any interesting facts about Susanna Martin from Aintree? I think it was in 71 when she was acquitted.
You related to Susanna Martin?
I have an interest in her
You have a very
because
large family, if so, because I seem to meet a lot of Susanna Martin relatives. She's one of my favorites because she's one of the few people who, when brought into court, is actually caustic and sarcastic with the judges. She gives them back quite what they're giving her. It's really remarkable that a sort of powerless older woman who had previously been accused of witchcraft would have been so gutsy. One of the charges against her is that she's able to travel swiftly and come in out of the rain with a dry coat. And she really doesn't see how that has anything to do with witchcraft. So she is extremely caustic with the judges. She gets nowhere. But she's one of a number of women who are strident, and we don't know if she's strident because she'd previously been accused or if she'd previously been accused because she's strident. And she doesn't fare well.
A kind of youthful question. Did you read The Witch of Blackbird Pond, the Newbery winner, when you were young?
I didn't read it when I was young because I was off of reading, but I did read it with my kids.
Okay.
And that was a beloved book by all of my children, yes, absolutely. And I think very much captures the feel of the place. There are several children's books that I think actually very aptly capture the feel of New England at that time and the sort of cramped, we didn't talk about this, but one of the real characters in this story is the dark. And it took me a long time to realize that, how black was when there's no artificial illumination. And you have any number of accounts on the record of people being turned around and lost in their own yards, and people being utterly disoriented by the dark. And many of these accounts by grown men who see the strangest things in the darkness once they start beginning to hear witchcraft testimony.
Hi, I'm related to Elizabeth Jackson Howe, and she was one of the witches. And I've done a little research on her, and her husband was blind, and she was a strong woman. And I would like maybe for you to address that idea that the women that were like strong and not taking on the traditional role of a woman were kind of subject to more accusations or something.
First of all, we should say about Elizabeth Howe, what's remarkable about her, she also is from Topsfield, is that she's accused only by family members. And she's not the first wife, she's not her husband's first wife, but I can't remember how many people, it's something like 25 family members accuse her, which is not uncommon at that point in the crisis. There are a number of women who are clearly, women who stand their ground, women who are strident, as I just said, women who are tough negotiators with craftsmen, women who have entered into court, who have been litigious themselves, who have contested inheritances, who are accused. However, for each one of those, there's also an angelic, subservient, lovely, devout woman who's also a full church member, who's also accused. And that's one of the crazy things with 1692 is that you don't, despite our stereotypes, we don't really have a pattern here. You have men, you have women, you have a 5-year-old homeless girl, and you have the richest merchant in Salem town. You have women who had been accused several times in the past and who are sort of local menaces, and then you have a devout woman, a grandmother, mother of 8 children who's never been in court a day in her life. Elizabeth Howe is great because she's accused of bewitching turnips and a cart and something else. I mean, she has and a rope as well. She has extraordinary powers. Cow.
Yes, it's been postulated that ergot poisoning has something to do with some of the cases because evidently this fungus that grows on rye and other grains can cause hallucinations and hyperextensions of joints. So how much do you think that could have been a reason for some of these trials to get started?
Will you forgive me if I say not at all? It's a great theory. It's a 1976 theory, not surprisingly, since it's about hallucinogenics. And and what's marvelous about it is, and it's a number of crises in history have been written down to ergot poisoning. I think there's a French Revolution theory about ergot poisoning as well. In fact, apparently, I haven't experimented, it does induce hallucinations. It doesn't hold up in 1692 for a number of reasons. It doesn't affect whole households. You'll have a household in which 2 girls are afflicted by witchcraft symptoms and 2 children are perfectly normal and they're eating the same food. The seasons of the year don't line up as they would with typical ergot poisoning. The entire household is presumably eating the same rye. Most importantly, I guess I would say, there are a number of reasons, but primarily, these girls are, when they hallucinate, are all hallucinating within synchronized imagery, and it tends to be religious imagery. If you and I were to hallucinate, we'd probably come up with some wackier and somewhat more individualized hallucinations than this very coordinated one. I mean, they tend to see what they've heard in church the week before. So it doesn't really hold up. It is the theory that just will not die, and I think part of the reason for that is that it exonerates everyone. That no one is guilty of anything if, in fact, these girls were hallucinating for natural reasons.
I was going to ask you about spectral evidence. In popular history, that's the turning point. As soon as the court rejects acceptance of spectral evidence, then you can no longer say, well, you're sitting here, but your spirit's over here tormenting me. Could you put it into some sort of context? And was spectral evidence a point of law that had been brought over from England, or was it new to New England?
Spectral evidence, it's a great question, we should say, is evidence that you and I can't see, but the bewitched can see. So if the bewitched says that this gentleman is actually wearing a top hat, not a Kansas
KU, yes.
hat, she's right and we're wrong. And that is the evidence on which, obviously, these convictions rest. The colony believes in spectral evidence because they believe it is what is being used in Britain. And I should back up and say that part of the problem here is that the New England ministry has made it impossible to read any skeptical books on witchcraft because they prefer to subscribe to the belief in witchcraft. So no one in Massachusetts in 1692 is really well aware of the fact that witchcraft prosecutions in England, and for that matter across the continent, have skidded to a halt, that there are no real prosecutions anymore for witchcraft, and that spectral evidence has been discounted. That question does arise, and Stoughton, whom I mentioned earlier, the Chief Justice, himself believes firmly in spectral evidence, and he will advise the court to use spectral evidence at face value. And it will proceed, and the convictions obviously will proceed from that belief. The newly seated governor, William Phipps, will by the end of the summer be somewhat confused by this. It doesn't seem to hold up in his mind. No one, by the way, doubts that witchcraft exists. They just doubt the methods of detection. So can spectral evidence be believed? The newly seated governor will write to some New York ministers because he's not sure that the Boston ministers really know what they're talking about. And he will basically ask them what they think of spectral evidence. And he will get a somewhat more diluted version of spectral evidence from them. The court, I should add, will ultimately reject spectral evidence, but they never reject the idea of witchcraft. And the idea of witchcraft will survive the trials. People still believe a year and 2 and 3 and 5 years later that there was witchcraft at work, and there will still be witchcraft afflictions years later, but they will reject the idea of spectral evidence, which is never used again in Massachusetts.
Hi, I'm Susan Foster Nelson, and so my many times grandmother is Ann Foster, and her daughter Mary Lacey. I'm not through Mary Lacey, but through her son Andrew, and then of course the granddaughter. So I had fun reading yours, and I've been back to Andover, and there's a place called Foster's Pond that's back there that I've been to. But anyway, and then I always refer, when somebody's talking to me and they ask me about this, I say, well, she was from Andover, and there were more people from Andover than from Salem that were accused. And I always figured that was because the trials were in Salem, which was the county seat, which, like any place else, if it was in the county seat, you would call the trials that. But I found it interesting in your book, when I was reading it, that you mentioned, if I got this right, was that there was a date, you found records up to a certain date, and then several months is missing, and then it starts up again. And that was what I thought was really interesting, because I've bought a lot of books reading about the transcripts, but yet you say that the transcripts are really other people writing things down. They weren't really the official court records. And then I also think I read that you said Cotton Mather actually went back and wrote his things in his journal. They weren't written at the time they happened, they were later. Anyway, so I thought that was really interesting.
One of the difficulties of working with this material are the things which are missing from this material, primarily the court papers, which we no longer have. So what we do have are the deposition papers, the examinations that went on before people went to trial. We have the confessions, we have the arrest warrants, we have Anne Foster's confession of her supposed flight through the air to a diabolical Sabbath, during which she crashes to the ground, which is why she starts the book. We have a lot of other material. We have the jailer's accounts. We don't have the court papers. And what happens once spectral evidence is discounted and once the court is shut down is that a general sense of shame and regret will fall upon this episode, to the point which you can read, not because anyone ever says it, but because the record suddenly comes to a halt. And if you go back and look at it, diaries are expurgated. The Salem Village church record does not exist for that entire summer. Samuel Willard's complete compendium of sermons, which includes no other great lacuna, jumps right over the summer of 1692. The best of the Massachusetts ministers' diaries, I was sitting reading this in the Massachusetts Historical Society one day, and through 1691, he records everything he fed to his horse and every haircut he ever had and every gust of wind. And I thought, this is going to be just a gold mine. And I turned the page, and it went from 1691 to 1693. The year is missing. One of the justices' correspondences is missing from that year. So yes, there's just this immense need to make it disappear, to just, stick it under the rug at this point. And that's what makes writing about these things infuriating. And many people go back. Cotton Mather goes back and writes. His diary is not written in real time, it's written retroactively. These are maniacal record keepers, which makes it very meaningful, though, that they would try this hard and for this long. Usually these kinds of wipeouts last for 3 generations. This lasts for hundreds, tells you something about New England, lasts for hundreds of years before Samantha will restore the history.
Well, I've never had the pleasure to read any of your books, but now I will. And, but tell me more about this witchcraft, or did they burn them when they found them guilty? They weren't hung,
They were hanged, in fact. They were not burned. The difference was, and I think I'll tell you why I think we think that a continental witch in the olden days was burned, an English witch was hanged. This was problematic when a few witches turned up in the Channel Islands in the early 17th century, because no one knew which law applied. So they were first hanged and then burned. But in any case, sorry, what was your question? Oh, were they hanged? Yes, they were taken to the gallows and hanged.
Was this a big public event?
It was a big public thing, and that ties into what I was saying about that sense of communal purity. It was education, it was spectacle, it was a way of reminding people of what the demands of piety were, of what happened to malefactors. Children were routinely taken to executions. It's very hard to say who wasn't there. Everyone would have been there. These were mass public spectacles, and each one of these hangings seems to have had sort of a carnivalesque atmosphere.
And I thought there was far more than just 20 that were found guilty.
There are hundreds of people accused, 19 people will hang, and one person is actually crushed to death under stones because he will not enter a plea in court, and that was the penalty for not entering a plea in court.
And what happened to the ones that went to jail? How long did they stay there?
Some of them die in jail. Some of them have babies and then die in jail. Some of them are freed ultimately when the crisis is over. A few people managed to escape, and that was usually a socioeconomic people. The rich people were able to buy their way out of jail. The poor people were not. And one person, the first person to confess to witchcraft, is in jail for 14 months before she's finally released. She's the slave in the minister's household, who's the first Tituba, as you may know from Arthur Miller, who's the first person to make a confession.
No, there being no more questions?
I think it must be debate time.
Right, exactly. So, Stacy Schiff, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
And we're going to bring a table out here for her to sign books. And if you would line up over on this side where Steve Wolfick is.